I'd like to ask you a few questions. I'd like to ask you to consider, and consider carefully, what it would be like to live in a country where you had a relationship with the government that was framed by a social contract or a covenant. I'd like you to pause and think for a moment and imagine what it might be like if that government started to infringe on your rights and to ignore that covenant. What would it be like if the government tampered with the economy in such a way that it left you without a means to earn a living? What would it be like if in their management style and techniques, they really restrained who you could have business affairs with? What would it be like living in a nation where you had a legislature that the government abolished so that you had no more representation and no more self-rule? What would it be like, and how would you respond to the fact of the government sending in people, military people, to govern and to have a place on every street corner, watching everything you did, checking out what you had to say, and watching all your meetings? What would it be like to approach these people and to try with great care and diligence to iron out the differences, and yet the only thing that ever happened was a continual aggravation of the circumstances? What would it be like to have a government that was taxing you, and all without your consent and the consent of your representatives, making pretense the rule of law? What would it be like to be under martial law and not have the right to trial by jury? Well, you don't have to pretend or think too far back when you think about these kinds of things, because this is how it was in 1775. The American colonies had been under the British government for some time. They'd been established with charters, each colony separately, that had a direct relationship to the Crown of England. Things had kind of gone sideways after the French and Indian War, when the British decided they were going to tax the colonies to pay for the execution of those wars. Some of the colonists didn't care for this very much. And in their disputes and their discussions, the government kept ramping up the interference that they were having on the colonies. Things had become so bad that the government was interfering with nearly every aspect of their lives. These people in this country were very, very cautious. They did not want to do anything that would cause an uproar, cause problems, cause confrontation, but they were unwilling to take the changes being forced down their throats without any kind of resistance. They had made overtures to the Parliament and the King in Britain, which all had been rejected. There were parliamentarians in Britain that favored the colonist situation, but they were in the minority. You may have heard of the Stamp Act. You may have heard of the Coercive Act, which was one of the few truth in politics pieces of legislation ever passed. The situation continued to get worse and worse, and the colonists began to organize themselves in resistance. They were publishing pamphlets. They were setting up methods of communication, systems of communication. You've probably heard of some of these leaders. You've probably heard of John Adams. You've probably heard of John Hancock. No doubt you've heard of Paul Revere. And there were many others like them. And they had organized a way of communicating with each other throughout the region without the aid of cell phones, Facebook, computers, email, any of that. It was all done by word of mouth. So as we approached the day of April 19, 1775, which you probably know as the day the shot was fired that was heard around the world, there was increasing tensions between the colonists and the Bostonians in particular. The people were not impressed at all with the conduct of the British soldiers as they interacted with them in their society. They were offended by the fact that they were required to quarter them in their homes. The British also had shut down the fisheries on the eastern seaboard, taking away a whole industry. And they were leaving the colonists in a situation where they really had very few, if any, choices. The colonists believed that they had only two choices. One was to live as slaves, as the British government managed everything that they were doing, or to stand up and resist and fight like free men. They obviously chose the latter. I think it's very important to understand many of the men that were prominent in their society were not only political figures, but were members of the ministry. There were men like Samuel Davies who nurtured men like Patrick Henry. There were men like Samuel Langdon who preached fiery sermons from his pulpit, not only about the moral improprieties of society, but also about political structures. There were men like John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton University, who had trained many of the ministers that were throughout the region. And as this movement towards independence came up, the British considered these men to be seditious simply because they were teaching from the pages of the Bible those things that God has said about government. So with this set up, I think it's important that we look back and we consider, how did the founding fathers deal with all of this? How did the founding generation come together and deal with all these things? What were the consequences of what they were thinking of doing? They did not want to confront the strongest, most powerful military nation in the world at the time. They did not want to see bloodshed. They simply wanted self-rule. This was intolerable for the British government. They weren't going to allow it, and thus the fire was kindled. They didn't know whether they would win. They had no idea if there were a military confrontation where they could even survive. For some of them, it would mean a trip across the seas to be tried as traitors and on charges of treason and hanged. For some of them, it was very likely that their homesteads would be ruined, burned, destroyed. Many of them would die. That's what it cost that founding generation. We have to ask ourselves, what does it cost us to ensure liberty and regain it in our daytime and have something of this sort to pass on to our posterity? The men of 1775 were extremely concerned about what they were going to leave further generations, and they acted in a belief that what they did was right and upright in the eyes of God. I would suggest that you do reading on these men, do some research of your own, and that you would take them at face value. I like to let people from history basically speak for themselves unless there's evidence that speaks otherwise of them. I would urge you to consider the things that they said. I would urge you to consider the things that they relied on for their perception of the world, their worldview. I would urge you to consider whether liberty is worth regaining and saving or not. Samuel Adams was a man who had a lot to say about what they were experiencing and was very, very active in the move towards independence. He's known by some also as the father of the Revolution. But these men were no revolutionaries in the style of the French Revolution. These were men that were seeking merely to reestablish the rule of law. So I commend to you Samuel Adams.